magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworld.eldar.com. I'm Brent, and it's finally happened, people. As of yesterday, the Aeldari Codex is live for pre-order, so GW-sanctioned and unsanctioned content creators alike are gossiping with great enthusiasm like dudes at a Victorian ball when some new hottie shows up in a carriage made of swan feathers and sexually transgressed social conventions. We're all a titter, people. And now that GW has lifted the gag order on talking about the new book, it's open season, even for those of us who try to refrain from spreading leaks in the hopes that Games Workshop will eventually legitimize us like some baron in a period drama, reluctantly acknowledging one of his byblows because the kid has a strong jawline and won the local Tiddlywinks championship. In this video, I'm going to talk first impressions of the Codex overall and lay out a plan for how I'm going to cover its content. I also feel it's only fair to acknowledge that Auspex Tactics already has a complete review up, as does Goonhammer, where there's a number of very well-written articles by James Boone Kelling, who's been a guest on the channel, and he's also over on the Discord, and so I would encourage you to check those out also. They're very, very good. So I'm not first. All I really have to offer here, aside from a slightly different perspective than those others and some other thoughts, is the promise that after generalist sites like Auspex Tactics have moved on to the next belle of the ball, I shall remain devoted to Space Elves even after they are besmirched by time and regular use and have been caught in flagrante delicto in the drawing room with the entire cast of Art of War. Okay, let's dive in. I want to just start by saying that overall, my first reaction to the new Codex has been incredibly enthusiastic. Not only have Space Elves been entirely rewritten to emphasize a mastermind playstyle dependent on forward planning and overlapping buffs, but every single one of the detachments looks not only fun to play, but at least somewhat competitively viable. I have no doubt that some of them are going to turn out to be more effective than others. I already have thoughts on which ones those are, but not a single one of them is just some narrative dumpster fire of overly cautious buffs and niche bonuses that neither tell an effective story on the table nor make the army fun and effective. And I'm not sure there's been another Codex in 10th edition without at least one detachment that nobody plays. Sorry, Dad, please legitimize me. I'm really good at Tiddlywinks. I guess maybe Tyranids. But the fact is that I'm genuinely excited to try out every single detachment in the book. And in talking to other Aeldari players about their top two, I have heard literally every detachment mentioned in someone's top two. Most exciting for me, however, is that the army has been redefined to once again be a high skill cap army that rewards mastery and punishes small mistakes. I enjoyed Index Aeldari, but smacking down opponents by utilizing my automatic rerolls and throwing fortune on my avatar didn't make me feel much like a farseer scanning the skeins of fate with an eye towards distant events. I have looked into the future and seen that making this fate die a 6 to trigger devastating wounds is clever. Never made an opponent say, "Curse you, Space Elves. Why are you so good at this game?" Instead, they say things like, "Yeah, I kind of figured you would do that," which just doesn't have quite the same ring. So anyway, I'm pretty excited about the total elf makeover, even though I liked Index Elves and they were very good. Okay, so here are my very general first impressions of the specific impacts on the play experience. Firstly, mobility is up on everything. Damage output on heavy weapons is down, as is the overall durability of most of our most durable units, as well as some others. While the damage from specialized infantry and maybe some bikes is way up. If you've not already watched my video on the new battle focus ability, you should probably hit that one right after this, or maybe even pause this one and right now, because I'm going to be referring to those rules a lot. But basically, the old Aeldari faction ability Fate Dice has been replaced with the ability to use 4 additional free stratagems called agile maneuvers per turn out of a list of 6, each of which grants significant mobility bonuses or other bonuses that happen around moving your elves around. These include a 2-inch movement buff to any kind of move. They include a D6 plus 1 movement buff for vehicles making normal moves. It includes the ability to shut down Overwatch fire, and one that lets you reposition on your opponent's turn with a unit that has been just shot by one of your opponent's units. So they resolve a shooting attack and you move the unit D6 plus 1 inches, maybe to move them out of line of sight of additional shooting attacks, or to claim an objective, or to simply bring a big, durable melee threat closer to the enemy. And there are other tricks too, but those are, I think, some of the primary ones. Also, some units have just gotten a little bit faster. Our slowest unit, the platforms, went, I think, from having a 3-inch move to now they have a 7-inch move, and Shining Spears can just like fly over terrain without having to do like the up and down measure that you usually have to do in 10th edition, and Harlequins jump over stuff. And there's all sorts of ways in which elves who are already quick are even quicker. Now, I think that the overall increase in mobility will have 3 significant impacts on the game. And the first, I think, is the most obvious. It will be harder than it was before, even harder for an opponent to hide from Space Elves. And perhaps the only space on the board that will be totally safe from Space Elf shooting, and maybe even some Space Elf melee, will be right up against obscuring ruins or opaque walls in the opponent's backfield on the first turn. And even then, we're only talking like a 3 or 4 inch area, because we can get right onto the edge of the board and draw lines of sight on all sorts of spots in our opponent's backfield on turn 1. Space Elf melee units will also benefit from tremendous additional mobility and will have a much easier time charging through terrain to tear up opponents trying to hide in the midfield. So post-Codex Space Elves in 10th edition are like Daniel Day-Lewis. We will find you no matter what occurs. The second implication for increased mobility is that secondary missions will be even easier to score. Historically, Aeldari have excelled at secondary scoring and struggled a bit with primary scoring, and the new Codex emphasizes that dichotomy more than ever before. We've lost access to the Swooping Hawk redeployability, but we just aren't going to need it as much in a world where we can move a Viper 14 inches plus D6 inches plus 1 inch and still perform an action with one of our like free battle focus tokens. A well thought out Aeldari list should really have no problem scoring big on secondaries, even against fearsome opponents, as the ability to get pretty much anywhere we need to be and then shut down Overwatch also if we need to makes it pretty hard, even for highly skilled opponents, to shut down our secondary scoring, unless they can kill most of our models pretty quickly, which is going to be hard, partly because elves are so good at running and hiding, and in part also because we have such ferocious damage output still that when they kill our stuff, we get to kill their stuff in response. So I don't think, if you're a little bit squirrely, I don't think you have to worry about getting like tabled in the first 2 turns. So secondary scoring is going to be a strength. I think we're going to be one of the best armies in the whole game for scoring secondaries. The third implication, when we already were, but now it's like on steroids. The third implication of increased mobility is that it will be easier than ever before to reposition our army in order to simply take a big chunk of the opponent's force out of the fight temporarily. And this is going to be really important because of other changes to data sheets. So the additional speed offered by Battle Focus gives us the option to deploy fast units on our flanks that can abruptly shift to the middle of the table if we need them to, depriving enemy flankers of viable targets for a turn, or maybe even 2. But if an opponent doesn't deploy to protect their flanks, they just end up yielding big chunks of the table where we can then redeploy deep strikers or score unopposed and so on. And this should make it possible for Space Elf players to bring a much greater percentage of their own force to bear while enduring proportionally less return fire, especially with the help of the fade away battle focus ability, which is the one that lets you move a unit D6 plus 1 inches after the opponent resolves a shooting attack against it, which you can do with almost anything with battle focus, and Guardian defenders do for free and don't stop you from doing it with other stuff. The increase in mobility is going to be our primary tool for mitigating some of the considerable nerfs to the most durable Space Elf units, as well as some cheaper units that were used for late game objective control before. So this is not exhaustive, but these I think are the big ones. The Avatar of Cain, the Wraith Lord, and Wraith Infantry have all lost a point of toughness. Warwalkers have lost their -1 to wound ability, which was crazy pants good, and their invulnerable save has gone from a 4+ to a 5+, so they're not like durable little mid-range vehicles anymore at all. Windriders and Shroudrunners have both lost a point off of their armor saves, which is particularly brutal for Shroudrunners, which have gone to a 5+, even though they've got a 5+ invuln. Nevertheless, that's still pretty rough. Wraith Knights no longer have damage reduction unless they take the Scatter Shield. The Yin-Karn no longer halves incoming damage. Fugan still stands up after death on a 2-up, but his 5+ Feel No Pain is gone. And perhaps most significantly, Fortune is just gone. So you can no longer make one of your already pretty durable units -1 to wound. And of course, you won't have access to Lightning Fast and all of the detachments anymore. And we can no longer use Fate dice to auto-succeed on a critical invulnerable save when we really need to. And Wraith Infantry are now capped at squads of 5, making the Resurrect ability with the Spirit Seer a bit less reliable, even though it still exists. The takeaway here is that it is simply no longer going to be possible for Space Elf players to include a couple of units in a list that are every bit as durable as anything else in the game, right? Space Elves have theoretically their brand is fragile glass cannons that, when used correctly with a symphony of overlapping buffs, are terrifying, but you've really got to be careful with them. And they really weren't that in the index. There were too many ways to be tough without needing to be clever, and there were too many ways to do a lot of damage without needing to be clever. So post-Codex Aeldari instead are doubling down on the Space Elf identity as a highly mobile hit-and-run army that relies on overlapping synergies to maximize damage, while we carefully pick exactly where we're going to hit our opponent and with what. And the tactical trade-off here is that primary objectives are going to be more complex to play than they were for Index Aeldari. So we can no longer just plop something on an objective out in the open as early as turn 1 in some matchups and rely on holding that objective despite considerable enemy fire. And don't get me wrong, the Avatar and Wraiths are still durable. Wraiths are especially so in the Spirit Host detachment, where they have a stratagem that really helps with that. But everything is going to need to be used more judiciously in the early game, because most intact competitive lists you play into, we'll be able to shoot anything that we have, any single thing that we have off an objective if they need to, especially if they don't have anything else that they really can target early on, which is likely. And I say intact because one of the ways we're going to play Space Elves to get around this is to make our opponent's lists unintact as quickly as we possibly can, so we have scoring tools. I'll talk about that later. When I read that list of durability debuffs, I suspect some of you may have panicked a little. I am going to say right now, this is really not that big a deal. It is if you're a very new player. Eldar are going to be harder to play. They're going to be harder to play. They're still going to be very good. It is a different kind of play experience. Even Index Aeldari, though, liked to do the majority of their primary scoring in the late game. They did. Turns 4 and 5, especially, that's where you score most of your primary points. And that imperative has simply been strengthened. Codex Aeldari will score primary points by playing conservatively the first 2 turns of the game while whittling away at an opponent's most dangerous units, then score big in the mid to late game to max out primaries when the board is safe enough for units like grav tanks or maybe some lone op characters to score in the mid board, or even just stuff like, I don't know, Shroud Runners. Again, this isn't new. It's just that without the option to pick up an extra 5 or 10 primary points in the early game with 1 or 2 supremely durable units, the necessity of planning ahead to get the late game scoring like just right is going to increase. In addition, I think the loss in durability combined with the reduction in the damage output for our long-range heavy weapons means that merely chipping away at an opponent's army at long range for the first 2 turns without taking comparable damage to our own force won't be enough anymore. It used to be, won't be enough anymore to give us the momentum we will need to have survivability and to score big in the late game. We are also going to need to make at least 2 or 3 big, aggressive, in-your-face plays on turn 1 or 2, where we get right up on top of an opponent with trading units like Fire Dragons, or maybe like Shining Spears, or maybe Leakus leading some Warp Spiders, in order to eliminate some key targets. Key targets are going to include, and just in case you glazed over while washing the dishes or thinking about that enigmatic hottie you dated in your 20s after she showed up at a ball looking all swannish and transgressive, this is a moment to pay attention again. Key targets are going to include enemy units that are a threat to the moderately durable units that we will use to hold objectives in the mid to late game, and so especially enemy heavy weapons and monsters, and enemy units that are fast enough to counter our mobility. If you can kill that stuff in the first 2 turns of the game, you should be able to win most of the time, I expect. I think turn 2 is going to be critical in every game for Space Elves. But exactly how we will best be able to pull off eliminating these units has changed quite a bit. Index Aeldari were able to make use of the Warhost rerolls to hit and wound, as well as fate dice, to massively increase the damage output from Bright Lances, from Fire Prisms, from D-Cannons, really anything with high damage and low rate of fire, which enabled us to blow away enemy tanks and monsters early, making eliminating our own durable units that much harder for an opponent. But without those rerolls and automatic devastating wounds to bypass invulnerable saves, or damage rolls of 8 automatically, Bright Lances and D-Cannons and other long-range shooting will be much more fickle. We would probably need almost twice as many of them for the same damage output as before. And that's not to say that Bright Lances won't still be very good. They definitely will, and you're going to want some shooting like that, I think, in most lists. It's just that we need to take a more broad-minded view going forward about big hits early on. And we have some new alternative tools for kicking demons back into the warp and reminding Monkai that they're really just a bunch of short-lived up-jumped primates strutting around the galaxy on easy mode because we cleaned it all out for them on the front end. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you might check out my lore video called Understanding Aeldari. In any event, the Codex is giving us some new ways to deliver big hits, mostly around highly specialized infantry and mounted units, and you're going to need to deliver some of these big hits early. Fire Dragons, people. Fire Dragons were already a top-tier unit for Index Aeldari, and they are even better now, with both substantially increased mobility and better damage output. They get full rerolls to wound against tanks and monsters, and all of their weapons have assault. This means that you can park a Wave Serpent, and there's a reason to use Wave Serpents instead of Falcons. You don't need the rerolls from Falcons. This means you can park a Wave Serpent out of sight in the midfield on turn 1, and on turn 2, have a bunch of Fire Dragons jump out 3 inches forward of the Serpent, then advance 9 plus D6 inches using agile maneuvers, then, or I guess it's really like 7 plus D6 plus 2 using agile maneuvers, but same difference. Then blast a hard target with full rerolls and crazy melta bonuses. And even though really tough stuff, they're going to be wounding on a 5, because you have full rerolls, it's still going to be really good. And if you have Fugan lead the squad and you give the Exarch a Fire Pike, you can trigger melta on the Fire Pike and on Fugan's special weapon, even at 9 inches. So even if they're coming in out of Deep Strike or something, because he increases the overall range of weapons in the squad by 6, taking the humble fusion guns to 18 inches and the lance and pike to 24, which is amazing. And if you're running the Spirit Host detachment, there's a stratagem that would let you teleport the entire unit into the enemy's deployment zone on turn 1, or within 9 inches of the enemy on turn 1. Then you don't even need a transport. And there are other overlapping buffs and synergies available that I'm not going to talk about here. But the fact of the matter is that Fire Dragons have significantly increased in their lethality but only trivially in their points. They were 90 before. They're about that much now, slightly more. I don't have access to the updated point values that are going to release the same day as the book. The ones in the book are already incorrect. We know that. But Goonhammer does have access to that information, and Boone confirmed in an article that went live yesterday that Fire Dragons are only facing a very minor cost increase. And in combination with a tremendous lethality increase, that makes them gold. Shining Spears are another unit that's been reworked to trade efficiently once again in previous editions, last couple editions. Shining Spears were one of the best trading units in the book, and in the index, they were pretty terrible. They got multiple point reductions, but they just couldn't get the job done. And now they're a really powerful tool that you can use to trade out of the gate. Using agile maneuvers, they can move 16 inches, shoot with their spears. They've got twin-linked catapults on 2 bikes. The Exarch will have a shuriken cannon, and then charge with their spears. And the shooting is no joke, right? In order to really get the most out of spears, you want them to be a hybrid unit. You want them to get that close range shooting within 6 and then also do the melee, but you won't always need to. But then when they charge now, their melee is actually really good into monsters and into anything really. Except I guess like maybe a really durable infantry model. They charge with spears that put out, the whole squad puts out 10 attacks at strength 5. They do flat 3 damage, and they have anti-vehicle and anti-monster 3+. So they always wound those things on a 3-up. And they have -2 AP on the regular lances and -3 on the Exarch, and 4 attacks are the Exarch. So presuming that like Fire Dragons, spears only receive a very minor increase to their points costs, they will now be able to trade effectively into medium weight tanks and monsters, especially the ones that are fast enough to go hunting for our fragile space elves trying to use Fade Away to disappear behind terrain, while every time they like skin their knees or someone shouts a particularly offensive insult, they just melt away when they take any damage. Our key units anyway, and our guardians. And so we don't want the enemy, your opponent, to have units that can counter that by going wide and getting lines of sight. And so spears are just going to be fabulous units for hunting down and destroying not only enemy tanks and monsters, but hypermobile enemy units also. Spears will be even more exceptional in aspect hosts, which is one of the detachments where they can benefit from rerolling ones to hit or ones to wound, depending. But even if you're not running an aspect host, presuming the point cost remains pretty low, I think they're still going to be a really useful tool. And one of those tools that you can use for a couple of these big early game trades that I think are going to be pretty essential to the Aeldari playstyle. There are other options too for adding some essential alpha strike punch to your new Aeldari list. Lekus, leading a bunch of warp spiders, can land in the enemy backfield on turn 1 and deal some nasty shooting and melee damage, while Warwalkers, making a scout move, can give all of your other elves an AP bonus into a single target that really needs to die. There are also ways to strip cover and gain various other bonuses, but I definitely think that each of us, for each list we build, will need to come up with a plan for a couple of pretty hard early game alpha strike trades that will enable us to edit our opponent's list into something less well suited to dealing with the galaxy's most elegant and fragile pointy-eared posh kids, right? We're going to need to redefine the nature of the engagement early, and that is what will make it possible for us to play the primary objective game and the mid and late game with our slightly more fragile than other factions tank hulls and units like Wraith Infantry or even bikes or whatever, or even maybe Guardians with some sort of defensive buff, who knows. So those are some broad playstyle changes that I am expecting will result from the new book. But I also want to talk about some, I think, significant changes to list building that we're likely to see more or less right out of the gate. One of the most notable of these is that the Autarch Wayleaper will no longer be a de facto include in every Aeldari list. And Foot Farseers, if they come along at all, I think they may often, Foot Farseers are no longer a backline unit that hands out fate dice buffs and fortune and helps you screen your backfield and just, stays safe. They're kind of like midfield, they're midfield combat enhancement utility unit things, which I'll talk about. The Autarch Wayleaper has lost Lone Operative, and both Autarchs have lost the additional CP generation that they provided. So I don't think Autarchs are going to be de facto includes anymore. Before, every Aeldari list had an Autarch, and now, with very few exceptions, and now I don't think that's a thing. In place of those other benefits that Autarchs used to give you, they have most notably gained the ability to lead Aspect Warrior units and to let the unit that they lead use a stratagem for -1 CP. So I don't think Autarchs will disappear entirely from lists, as Aeldari stratagems are by and large exceptional, and the opportunity to add significant damage output to the squad will be especially tempting for fast units like Spiders and Hawks, which would love to have a Starglaive and a Fusion Gun in their unit. Or units like Scorpions that can scout before the game begins would love to have a Starglaive and a Fusion Gun and maybe some crazy enhancement, because that's the other thing. Autarchs will make it possible to introduce enhancements into Aspect squads, which could create some pretty potent combos. And when I talk about individual unit detachments and the enhancement options and stuff, we'll talk about some of those. But for now, we're just looking at the broad way in which list building will change. And I think that Autarchs are no longer auto-includes, but they may still appear, but they're just in this very different role. They're in a combat role now, super juicy in Aspect squads. On the other hand, adding an Autarch will often be, I think, questionable, because Aspect squads generally want to be trading units, and Autarchs are so expensive that in many cases, you can probably get just about a whole nother squadron of those Aspect Warriors instead of an Autarch. And if you want to trade effectively, maybe that's the thing to do, right? Instead of adding the Autarch. Furthermore, even when we decide that we do want to juice a squad, we may be more tempted to include the Phoenix Lord. And I think it's safe to assume that Autarchs without enhancements will be cheaper than Phoenix Lords. But nevertheless, the Phoenix Lord stat sheets are looking pretty amazing, and it could be hard, with a few exceptions, and it could be hard for Autarchs to compete. One of the exceptions is Striking Scorpions, of course, who probably won't get Karandros back until 11th edition. He's not in the Codex, people. He's gone. No Karandros this edition, probably. And those Striking Scorpions would certainly love to have that melee powerhouse, as we already mentioned, up there in the midfield before the game begins. And I think there's probably also going to be a good argument for running, if you're running Dark Reapers, to run, if you were to add an Autarch, the Autarch with a launcher, maybe some enhancement or other buffs, is probably a better bet than Malgan Ra, unfortunately. Malgan Ra still might quite not be there, but I am sure that there will be some free stratagem or enhancement combos that make Autarchs the favored pick in a variety of units, at least in certain detachments. They're no longer auto-includes, but there will be situations probably in which we want that instead of the Phoenix Lord. In place of the ever-present Autarch Warlord, I think we are going to see a lot of instances of Eldrad Ulthron warlording it up, because he now generates the extra CP that many Aeldari lists depend on, and his Doom ability is not only pretty good, but it's a lot easier to use than before in the Index days, because for a variety of reasons. One, he can join a squad of Guardians, and Guardians get a free move of D6+1 when an enemy unit resolves a shooting attack against them. So that will make it easier for him to doom something and then scuttle away to safety. Doom is also even better than it was before. You pick an enemy unit within 18 inches of Eldred Invisible, and until your next command phase, all friendly models have +1 to wound against that unit. You no longer have to roll and get a 2 or better, and it lasts until the next command phase. So that's your shooting phase, your melee phase, your opponent's. If you fire Overwatch on your opponent's turn, melee on your opponent's, it's everything. And this can be absolutely insane for buffing the damage output of high volume of fire units that already have decent AP, but relatively low strength. And in combination with the AP bonus that something like Warwalkers hand out, Doom makes it possible for units like Dire Avengers and Guardians to put serious hurt on tanks and monsters, like maybe just blowing them off of the board. And even something like Banshees coming out of a Falcon. And Falcons can still grant rerolls to wound with fire support. So Banshees coming out of a Falcon would be able to add some serious damage to a doomed target because the Falcon would let them reroll the wound roll. Eldred would give them +1, so even ridiculously tough stuff they'd be wounding on a 5, and their swords now do flat 2 damage, and the Exarch can take a glaive that lets her do flat 3 with good AP. So there are all sorts of ways to use Eldred's Doom ability to cause other units to multi-class into hard target elimination. And if you're worried about, I already mentioned that Fire and Fade thing, but what do we call it? Fade back or something. If you're worried about how to keep Eldred safe, there are a couple of interesting options. So if you do put him into a Guardian squad, he may not just be there with the Guardians. Guardian squads have become flexible platforms that can be joined by multiple Warlocks, as well as a Farseer, and as well as a support platform, not to be confused with their anti-grav platform. The support platform is a separate data sheet. It's things like the Shadow Weaver and the D-Cannon and the Vibro Cannon, right? So they can now join Guardian squads. So you could have a pretty expensive Guardian squad running around with the platform and multiple Warlocks and Eldred or some Farseer, and it would get pretty expensive, but that's a lot of additional bodies. It's a lot of additional wounds. There's some invulns in there. And the Warlocks don't have the character keyword, so you can defensively trigger their invuln save without them being the last models in the unit or whatever. And depending somewhat on the detachment that you select, this combo can be further enhanced with durability buffs that can help it survive a shooting attack before its fade move behind a ruin or something, using the free agile maneuverability. You can put lightning fast on it. There are other options. There's also a way, depending on the composition of the squad, to jump it back into a transport for the first time. If a transport that's like sitting out of line of sight during an opponent's turn, and if your opponent shoots at the squad, there's a way. In some builds, there'll be a way to do this, which, in addition to simply shielding the squad from further shooting attacks, it gives the souped up Space Elves tremendous mobility options before using all their tricks again on the next turn. Obviously, you're not putting a support platform in a transport, but other stuff, yes. And other Farseer, even if it's not Eldred, other Farseers provide other sorts of bonuses to Guardians with some dice manipulation that, in combination with other buffs, can actually make those squads bizarrely effective into even tanks and monsters, in addition to the light and like medium weight infantry that they were already pretty good into. Storm Guardians too can pop hard targets in a single turn if they're souped in all the right ways, especially in combination with the grenade stratagem, which lets you lead with a bunch of mortal wounds. I will not be surprised if a command style Guardian unit of some kind, like a command squad Guardian unit, becomes a positional anchor in quite a few competitive lists. It will need to be very carefully run for its points to be worthwhile, but I think that it is an incredibly interesting tool that has the potential to be enormously multifaceted if well played. Okay, one more big change I expect to see to list building, and this is going to be around lone operative includes. So previously, we were using the Autarch Wayleaper generally for some pretty essential lone op presence in most Aeldari lists. And for you newer players, lone operative is like an ability that is, I think, available. I think something has lone op in every army. Someone's going to correct me about that. But it's an ability that prevents usually a character model from being targeted by anything that's not pretty close to it, which not only keeps that character safe, but gives you an opportunity to perform secondary actions and score primary objectives more easily without having to worry about being sniped by an opponent at long distance. And now that the Autarch Wayleaper has lost that, and Illic Night Spear is gone from the Codex, which would have been a great fallback option. He was only 70 points before. We're going to have to rethink how we control the objective in our own backfield, and also to some degree how we play midfield objectives and what we want to do right with that gap. We might see a lot of lists taking a single Death Jester or a single Solitaire. Both of these have lone op. And so it seems that lone op to some degree for Elves is now a Harlequin thing. And each of these has a reasonably good case to be made for it, right? The Solitaire gives you not only a lone op model that's pretty quick on its feet that can help you score secondaries and control an objective in your own backfield, but also is a really good deep strike deterrent and backfield melee counter puncher. The Solitaire is still an incredibly, somewhat fragile, but incredibly powerful melee infantry killer, while the Death Jester is a little bit cheaper than the Solitaire and a decent shooting unit, but without access to Fate's Messenger, it won't be anything like the Terror it was in the Index, but it could still be a pretty cheap option for lone op. And if it's even cheaper than it was before, which I'm not expecting, but would be nice, then it might be a really strong pick. There's some other options, however, even if you don't want to take a lone up Harlequin character. Storm Guardians. Storm Guardians make an objective sticky if they are within range at the end of your command phase, which for you newer players means you continue to control the objective. A sticky objective is you continue to control the objective without having any models on it, so long as your opponent doesn't control it at the end of any phase. And Storm Guardians can do this for you. And this means you will sometimes be able to make your backfield objective sticky with the Guardians because it's command phase, and then move off before your opponent is really even ever able to target them or do anything about it. Some of the specific detachments offer other solutions for this. The Seer Council detachment can give a unit near a Psyker lone op outside of 18 inches of the enemy. So you could plop some long-range fire support like Dark Reapers on your backfield objective and control it for the whole game, while also screening your backfield from deep strikers and contributing to the battle with pretty good long-range fire support. Lastly, if you're running the Spirit Conclave Wraith-oriented detachment, you can use the Spirit Token Stratagem to make any objective sticky if you have Wraith infantry on it when your movement phase begins. And there are probably going to be other tricks as well that I haven't thought of yet for backfield objective control. And also plenty of primary missions don't really benefit you for controlling your backfield objective anyway, but they usually do reward your opponent for taking it. And in those missions, screening your backfield is much more important than actually controlling your own backfield objective. And you can often screen your backfield without actually having something stand out in the open. So sometimes the loss of the Autarch Wayleaper isn't really going to matter at all that much anyway, as long as you do have something that can hang out back there and contribute to the battle in some way and keep opponents from deep striking in right on top of you. Now, also, the fact is that none of us really know yet exactly how new Space Elves are going to play. So maybe it will turn out that some of my initial thoughts are overly centered on thinking about how changes to detachment abilities and faction abilities and data cards will create gaps that did not exist for Index Aeldari, but maybe those gaps aren't going to matter because something about the way new Eldar play will kind of invalidate those concerns. We don't know. We're all going to have to practice with this and get a bunch of reps in. Okay, that's what I've got. That's a lie. I have so very much more, but that is all I'm going to say in this video, which really is just a general overview of how Space Elves have shifted in terms of broad tactics and list building. I think it's all conjecture. And in the coming days, I will drop additional videos covering the numerous changes to various data sheets, as well as a video on each of the new detachments. My initial coverage of the data sheets will be largely informational. I will mention where there appear to be really good tactical opportunities or significant weaknesses. But for the most part, I'm just going to be going over how the data sheets have changed. And then in the coming months, I will produce in-depth unit-focused videos for many of the new data sheets once I have had a chance to get a bunch of games in with the new rules and play a variety of new detachments. But that is a thing we do later when we've played the new rules a bunch. If you have your own ideas about how the Aeldari playstyle and list construction will change as a result of the new book, please leave those in the comments below. If you don't have any ideas, just saying hi helps out the algorithm, as does liking and subscribing. As ever, a big thank you to my patrons and to the Magnet Baron who make this content possible. I have especially enjoyed hearing everyone's theories and fears and excitement over on the Discord, which you too could join by becoming a patron, which is only $3 a month, and I'll put the link in the description below. Okay, I'm off to address some of the tasks, real-world tasks I have been neglecting since I started obsessively working on this video. But I will be back again very soon with part 2 of the full Codex review. And until then, best of luck planning your first post-Codex list.